Yeah.
A little, yeah.
Yeah, briefly, cool. Yeah, she saw me wandering aimlessly in the parking lot.
So you still down with going to get some pizza?
Yeah, that's, if you want.
Yes.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Who, like Bobby did that?
Sweet.
I give my students extra credit. Well, if they want. They don't have to write 500 words though.
Now they do.
They're working to have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
do have to write something. But
we
not,
do like a perspective taking exercise. What did the speaker say? Yeah. Here's a objection to it, or worry about it, a response to it, and how do you think it would reply? Right, so basically like. Yeah. They're great. Actually, just wrote one and it was awesome.
there's room up here. There's room up here. I don't bite. I have a mask on.
This couch is very comfortable and I don't smell.
Yeah.
I have a question. Is this like, where is this? Is it gonna be on Tuesday or?
If you email,
Yeah, if you email steele@hendrix.edu, we'll send you a video. It won't be posted as a video.
you'll just have to email for a request
Yeah,
for the
it's not gonna be
recording.
like put up online or whatever.
I just got out of baseball.
Oh, yeah. So it is you.
It's
I was
me.
wondering.
All right, well, let's begin. Thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to the Wednesday afternoon discussion. Psyched to introduce Dr. Eric Dickman from University of Ozarks, which is just down the road here. So we're happy to have a local with us today. And Dr. Dickman specializes in philosophy of religion, hermeneutics, continental philosophy, teaching the same stuff I am, teaching Hegel this semester, just
Yeah.
like I am.
We're just talking about.
So yeah, so and he's written a bunch of books. This book on using questions to think, which is a great introduction to what philosophy enables you to do in critical thinking and raising questions in particular. And after reading some of it, it inspired me to teach questioning in my class, and that's what I do. So thank you for that. And you've got a new book coming out. Is that right?
This one just came
Just
out,
came out.
and this is what I'm going to be talking about today.
Yeah.
And then I have another one coming out later on next year on interpretation. But before I start,
Yeah.
can
Well,
I take a
welcome first.
selfie?
Let's give him a round of applause. Welcome. Thank you, Steele Center. Thank you for talking about whether does God exist.
I would like to take a selfie that I can send to my mom.
Yeah, all right, everybody. Elena, get over.
Can we get in a little bit? Does this get everybody? Almost. I'll take two,
Can I give the
I'll do this one first.
All right.
and then this one here. Good here. 1, 2, 3. And then one more. All right, thank you.
Thanks for including me.
Okay,
So
so
everybody online, if you're during question period, please raise your hands and whatnot.
Steele Center photo shoot. I love it.
I can hear you just a little bit. So you might need to type it in the chat if you can.
Welcome to everybody. All right, cool.
All right, folks.
Go ahead.
Thank you for having me here. I'm grateful to be here. Last time I did more of a PowerPoint presentation type thing. This time I just sketched a few notes because I just kind of want to see if it'll create some conversation for us. So what I'm going to do is lay out, let's see, I've got, 4 themes that I want to address and then think of them as threads and then weave them together by the end. So it might be disjointed for a little bit, but eventually it'll all tie together. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we can call grammatical critique from Ludwig Wittgenstein. If you're familiar with him, philosophy of language. At first, he was trying to characterize a theory of language where language is representational of reality. And so you know what you're saying is true if it maps on or correlates to or corresponds to ultimately the facts. And then later on, he decides, well, look, what do you do? What does this represent, right? Okay, so, and he goes, well, wait, maybe a different way to think about this is language and its use, how language is used. It's not about representation, it's about function. And so I'm really interested in this kind of analysis that he pulls out of this language as use or meaning as use, really. That he's looking at ways that we can use this grammatical critique. He doesn't mean grammar in the textbook sense of grammar. He means it in the sense of structures of meaningfulness, like how is meaning generated as a social practice, instead of thinking of language as this thing on the inside, or language can't ever capture what we're thinking, but instead language is really about our social relationships. And so what I like about this is that he gives us leverage for criticizing certain things that tempt us into metaphysical speculation. So for example, I don't know where he said this sentence. I'm pretty sure he did, but I've done extensive research on it. I even had digital access and like done the F function, the search function, and couldn't find this. So anyway, so there's this example where he says, here's a sentence that's going to immediately tempt us to metaphysical speculation. Everything just increased by 10 times its size. Right? And how do you prove that that's false? You go, let's get a ruler. Well, the problem with the ruler is that the ruler also increased by 10 times its size, right? Okay, so now all of a sudden we're starting to, it's like you're on LSD, you're going, whoa, this is trippy, right? Like, how is everything not increasing or decreasing in size? And so it starts to seem really deep. This is metaphysical speculation, theories of reality, right? We start to think that we're going to get deep here. And Wittgenstein says we can use grammatical critique to expose the problem with that kind of thought. And the problem is the structure of the sentence. It's actually a superficial problem. Everything just increased by 10 times the size. Let's split that up into its parts. You all know, like, a complete thought consists of 2, 3 parts. Do you know what they are? What does every complete thought have to have? You all know that? Noun.
Subject.
Sure, a noun and or subject, so they're the same. They're just the Latin
Yeah.
version. The noun is the Greek term, subject is the Latin term. Okay, so noun and verb, or subject and a predicate. I'm going to use subject and predicate, but we could just as easily do noun and verb. So everything is the subject of the sentence. Just increased by 10 times its size is the predicate. Good enough. I mean, there's copula. We can start talking about more parts, but that's good enough for now. So an analysis that we can do to get us to resist the metaphysical speculation or not succumb to that temptation is to look at the grammar of that sentence and say, well, wait, what is the real function of a noun? What is the real function of a subject? The function of a subject is to pick one thing out from among the undifferentiated horizon, or to pick one thing out from everything. And so everything can't properly function as the subject of a sentence that's going to be meaningful. True or false, right? Yeah, we can use it for poetry, but in trying to say something that can be true or false, everything. And so I think about this with students. Sometimes we're reading Hegel and students came up to me and they're like, I don't understand this. And I'm like, what don't you understand? And they say everything, right? And I'm like, that I can't know where to help you because I need something specific. So now if we think about that sentence, everything just increased by 10 times its size, we can resist the temptation toward metaphysical speculation, bring it back down to earth and say, no, the problem with that is simply linguistic, is trying to use a subject of a sentence, everything, that can't function properly as a subject of a sentence. So I've become really fascinated with this kind of method because to me, it's super clever, right? Like, think of other problems that we run into in philosophy. Is there free will, or you know, you can come up with more topics, but maybe the problem is less, do we have free will, and more, are we using the right terms for what we're trying to talk about? And could we avoid the puzzle that we get into by fixing the words about it? Okay, so that's thread one. Just to give a couple more examples. nothing lasts forever. Again, nothing, it might lead to some interesting poetry, it might lead to the generation of new concepts, but nothing really should work as the subject of a sentence. Like nothing weighs 10 pounds. No. Don't take that sentence wrong. I'm not saying there is nothing that weighs 10 pounds. I'm saying nothingness. Okay, never mind. Let's flip it. Let's think of problems with predicates or verbs. My name is Eric. Okay, so these shoes are Eric. These shoes are so Eric. Now it's kind of like, oh, that's Eric's style. You get what I'm saying, right? But a name, a proper name, can't work as a predicate. You all follow so far? Okay, so subject and predicates are key. So that's one thread. Thread number 2, which is in the background and it has to do more with the blue book than this yellow one, is I'm really interested in this subject-predicate relationship because of its power in logic. So you think about symbolic logic when you're doing categorical logic, like all human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, therefore, what? Yeah, poor Socrates is always the example. He's going to die every time, right? So categories, that's just the Greek word for the Latin word predicate. So predicate logic, this what has been developed in the last 200 years. Predicate logic is an advance on categorical logic, trying to get at this relationship between specific things that actually exist and just the relationship between predicates or categories. So trying to get at the existence of particular things, and that's where we can get traction on true and false claims. But I'm especially interested in this logic stuff because it connects with erotetic logic, or in other words, the logic of question and answer. So if I ask you, like, where are my car keys? And you say over there, right? Your car keys is the subject, and I'm asking for the predicate. Or I could say, what's for dinner? And you're like, pizza, okay? You've given me the subject because I had the predicate in the question. So we can think of our questions as either showing the indeterminacy on the predicate side of the complete thought or showing the indeterminacy on the subject side of the complete thought. Follow? All right. So I'm really interested in that because it gets traction into what's the relationship between questions and logic. Because when we study logic, we just study if P then Q, P therefore Q. It's just the claims. We don't actually ask what is the question to which P is answering. So we're not really understanding the content. We're only really tracking the formal relationship between the propositions. Good enough for that. I'm going to skip to the next one. So ultimately, what I'm going to do when I bring the threads together is critique institutionalized philosophy of religion. So on the whole, if you get a textbook in philosophy of religion, you look at websites that are saying, here's like philosophy of religion. You want to know what's going on? This is what you should study. When we look at the publication industry, the textbooks, they tend to focus on what we can call the omni, this God that is considered to be what? All-knowing, all-powerful, all good, perfect, whatever. And so so when you read a textbook on philosophy of religion, you'll see things like, well, let's analyze the concept. God is all-powerful. What do we really mean by that concept, all-powerful? Can this God make a boulder so big that the God can't lift? Can this God make a round square? Is calling into question the nature of what we mean by all-powerful, okay? But this becomes the focal point in philosophy of religion. Another question might be, if this God knows everything, all-knowing, is that compatible with free will? Because if you do something that surprises the God, then the God didn't know, so that can't work if the God is all-knowing. But then if you have to do everything that the God already knows that you're going to do, then do you really have free will? So these are some serious questions that come up in philosophy of religion, but they become the standard, normal, typical content. That's the notion that's usually isolated, but this is a standard belief on a popular level too. For instance, are you all familiar with the Pew Research group? They do surveys of the US, like demographics, like, for instance, they might say, what are the voting tendencies of evangelical Christians or something like this, okay? So one of the things that they did is they tried to survey people on their beliefs in God. And, there's this growing category of respondents. It started with, I'm spiritual but not religious. Have you heard that phrase before? I'm spiritual but not religious. So there's a growing group of people that are calling themselves nothing in particular. It's not even I'm spiritual but not religious. It's just I'm not religious at all. Like I'm not spiritual really at all. But even that group of people, when they're surveyed on their beliefs about God, they will say, well, I don't believe in the God of the Christian Bible, but I do believe in a higher power. And so even though they are called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, okay, nuns, they still end up articulating things that are very similar to this omni. Let's see. It's not new, though. We can look at medieval philosophers like Aquinas, Moses Maimonides, Ivan Rush, Ibn Sina, others that are talking about this kind of perfect being. And they're getting it not so much from their scriptural traditions. They're getting this idea primarily through Platonism, through Plato. Because like you read the Republic and they're talking about what myths they're going to edit out of their ideal city. Have you all read the Republic or heard of the Republic? Have you heard of Plato? Okay, so he's got this book, The Republic. He's trying to design the ideal city. And in that design of the ideal city, here's the stories that we're going to educate kids on. But we're going to edit out some of the stories that we've inherited. And he's looking at ancient Greece. So they're talking about the mythology of like Zeus and all these stories. Have you heard of Zeus? Is Zeus a good guy? Do you know what Zeus does? I mean, he's awful. He's awful. All right. And so that's part of the point that Socrates or Plato through Socrates is making, that no being that's worth calling God would behave that way. There are certain principles or criteria by which we can distinguish a God worth believing in versus God not worth believing in. And one of the criteria is, and this is where we're going to get into what I'm going to get into, the God doesn't change. The God can't change. That means that the God can't have feelings, because feelings are literally our capacity to change. The God can't have feelings. And if you define love as partly a feeling, and you believe that the God is perfect, then you think that God, by biological connection, right, can't be loving. Yikes.
So jealous.
Right, or jealous, right? So now all of a sudden we've got this concept of God that's starting to float into these genuinely committed religious thinkers like Aquinas, Augustine, but also other traditions like I said before, Maimonides, Ivan Rush, and others, which is very different from the idea of God or the character of Yahweh or whoever, right? So I want to say more about that. This excludes, so this concept becomes the standard to the point where, I'm going to look at the rhetorical level, to the point where people will say, this is the traditional God. They'll use the word traditional to talk about that God, the Omni. But we just said that it's not compatible with the religious text, the narrative, at least not in a direct way. But also, have you all heard of Vishnu,
Yes,
Shiva,
yes,
right? Are there traditions
yes,
for these gods?
yes.
Do they count as a traditional god? Just say yes. Yeah, okay, right. So in the textbook industry or the kind of policing of the boundaries of what counts as real philosophy of religion, they're never going to talk about Vishnu. Which, if they're going to say they're talking about the traditional God, and you're going to say that Vishnu is not the traditional God, it is. You see what am I making sense? Not really. So I'm trying to say that there are these people who are like professors of philosophy of religion who say this is what we should talk about when we talk about philosophy of religion. And Vishnu is usually left out when they say we're going to talk about the traditional God.
Unless you're,
Oh,
unless you're,
okay, yeah.
unless you're a Hindu professor. Oh, yeah.
It gets a little more complicated.
I think in Hinduism we have like only one god. There's just a bunch of like avatars or whatever.
Right. So we could start getting
Yeah.
into the metaphysics of like Brahman, Vishnu, Krishna,
Yeah.
right, and all this, right? That would be really awesome. But that's not something that shows up in the publication industry that's called philosophy of religion. It might show up
Western or
in
otherwise.
it might show up in Asian philosophy. It might show up in religious studies, but philosophy of religion is Christian centric. But they'll also, so I'm trying to do exactly what we're doing. Like you're clearly aligned with what I'm getting at here, which is they're arbitrarily excluding certain religious traditions from counting. The other thing that they'll do is they'll say the Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Christian God. And that's problematic too, because hey, have you ever met a Jew say the phrase Judeo-Christian? It serves the interests of Christians wiping out their anti-Semitism by saying, no, we all get along when they say Judeo/Christian, okay? So it's this attempt to be inclusive, but the other problem with that phrase, from Western religious traditions, who's being excluded? Say it again? Yeah, right? If you're going to do it, say Jewish, Christian, and Islamic God. I don't know if you all know about Larissa Hawkins. She was a professor at what's the Wheaton College in Chicago. It's an evangelical Christian school. She's a professor of political science, and she put on a hijab. She's Christian. She put on a hijab to have what she calls embodied solidarity with people. This was right around the time of the proposal for the so-called Muslim ban from Trump. She puts on the hijab and says, look, I'm in solidarity with my Muslim sisters and brothers. And they fired her because she said the sentence, Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And these evangelical Christians are like, you're wrong. She literally lost her job over that sentence. The sentence, we worship the same God. Okay, good enough. Go ahead.
So in Islamic religion, they worship like the Prophet Muhammad, right?
No, they don't. Definitely do not worship. Venerate, respect, but worship is different from respecting and admiring. We good?
Yeah.
The reason being, so if you look at like dictionaries from the early 1980s, late 70s, they don't call Islam Islam. They call Islam Mohammedanism because they caricatured Islam as worshiping Muhammad. That's why they, just like Christians worship Jesus, Muslims worship Muhammad, right? And Muslims are like, that's not what we do. We don't worship Muhammad. We respect, we admire, whatever, but we don't worship him. We only worship God. There's no God but God. That's their position. We good?
Yes.
Did you want to ask more? Say it again.
No, I said thank you for it.
All right. So often what will happen in an attempt to make the Omni being compatible with the gods that show up in religious narratives, you've got to do some interpretive or hermeneutic legwork to make your narrative consistent with your theology, which actually can be problematic. And this is partly why I'm really interested in this part. Okay, so I've gotten most of the threads. Now I'm going to try to weave it together. So I want to talk about grammatical issues with the word God. And like the title was, why is the question, does God exist, nonsensical? So let's think all the way back to the subject and predicate and the questions there. So when someone asks, does God exist, or someone says, God does not exist, and I teach this to all my students. So let's switch it. Let's go back to Muslims, okay? Since you asked the question. If I were to ask you, what do Muslims believe? What really should be your first response? And folks on Zoom, you can't answer. My students are on Zoom. They're crashing. What should be your first response if somebody says, what do Buddhists believe? Or if somebody asks you, what do feminists believe? What's your first response? Which feminists? Which Muslims? Which Buddhists? Because you speak with 20 different Muslims, you're going to get maybe 40 different belief systems. Have you ever talked with a person? We are inconsistent with ourselves, let alone each other. So if I were to ask you, what do Christians believe? What should be the first response? Right? Which Christians? Are we talking about Mormons, LDS, right? Are we talking about Catholics? Are we talking about non-denominational, Presbyterians? What's this? Methodists here? Right? Which one are we talking? And even within that, what do Methodists believe? Which Methodists? Because, I mean, there's some controversial issues, right? LGBTQIA plus stuff, right? Okay, so if I ask, does God exist? The same principle applies. The same response applies. Does God exist? Say it again. Now all of a sudden we're bringing the concept down to earth. We're trying to talk about a specific, which specific God are you talking about? Yeah. Okay, so that's where I'm starting to come at this question to say it's nonsensical in the literal meaning of the sentence is ungrammatical. So let's compare it to a different context.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it. Go for it.
So you're talking about the whole sentence is nonsensical, or we're talking about the subject and the predicate. Does the subject is God exist is the predicate?
Yeah.
I think the same thing could apply to exist, because how do you define exist? Does it exist?
No, I mean, there are people who try to define existence, and that's right?
Or as a
So,
concept, or
but
as an
let's say
idea?
that we lay it out, and let's say I could specify which God I'm talking about. Usually people respond with, duh, obviously the God.
Yeah.
When I say which God, they're like, duh, obviously the right one.
Yeah, or like flipping, like
Right? And this is where they're talking about the omni usually. They're not talking about Yahweh because, right, like Yahweh is genocidal. He's gonna wipe out the whole human race. I mean, it's the angels' fault because they were raping human beings, but that's another story. We don't have to get into the biblical stuff. So what I want to get at is, let's think of other examples, like hero. Who is somebody that you think is a hero, or let's say superhero? Who is a superhero? Can we name any? Superman, yay. Any others?
Green Lantern.
Ooh, one more.
Spider-Man.
Really?
about
Spider-Man's good.
Flash.
Flash, but I mean, we can keep going, okay? But notice the same thing's happening. Which superhero? So if I say the question, does superhero exist? What's the problem with that question? Can you answer that question? Does superhero exist? Why not though? Can you explain the problem with that question? Think of the subject and the predicate issue. I'm trying to use a word as a subject of a complete thought that just can't work as a subject of a complete thought. I mean, look, we could do conceptual analysis of the concept superhero. And at that moment, we could use the word superhero as a subject of a sentence. But I'm not talking about existence at that moment. I'm doing conceptual clarification. And that's very different from claiming that something exists. This is where, so does superhero exist is different than do superheroes have arms? Okay. Now all of a sudden we're in the conceptual, like what is the concept of a superhero? Do gods fly? Okay, all right, we can get into that. Some seem to, not all. But anyway, so we see the problem with we're trying to use a word that can't work as a subject of a sentence with an existence claim to try to ask the question about existence. That's why it's nonsensical. We could do the same thing with something like president. Does president exist? That doesn't make any sense. Who is the president? Who is the president? Biden or is it Trump? It's Trump. It is Trump. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. It is not Trump. But you see the problem with that. Like I asked, does president exist? And we're like, that question does not make sense. You've got to specify you've got to make it more specific, or you've got to give a proper name. And so this is what I'm trying to do with the question of does God exist? It's which God are you really talking about? And if you're talking about the omni being, I'm actually not as interested as I am in beings that are showing up in narratives. So like, what is the character of, like we say Yahweh, but it's technically 4 consonants in a row. That's the dude's name. But it's unpronounceable to say 4. Nietzsche, you're getting close. Right? I think there's 4 consonants there. Anyway, so that is the God's name. And so what I really want to know is who is Yahweh? What's he like, or she, or it? I mean, what's the appropriate pronoun for this person? And B, given that this is what this person is like, does that person exist? That's what I want to know. Christianity is kind of interesting here, and it connects with what we're saying about Hinduism too, because you have a complex notion of a God, right? If the name of God in Christianity or in Judaism is Yahweh, if the name of God in Greek mythology is Zeus, one of the gods, right? If we got Vishnu as the name of God, we'll come back to that complication. But in Christianity, what's the personal name of God? That's still Judaism, but I mean, it's using Christianity, but that is just the generic concept, the God. This is technically it's plural.
That's what that translates.
Yeah. El, Elohim, Im is the plural, and then is it El, the? I think it's the. Anyway.
I was reaching way back.
Yeah. But again, so that's not, we're not quite to a name there. What Christianity is the Trinity. The Trinity is God, right? God the Son, God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, something like this, okay? Like, and so we can do something similar with Hinduism if we think that there's one God that manifests, and the same thing with Olodumare in African traditions, well, Yoruba in particular. That God can show up in many places because it's a complex manifestation. But then you're still talking about Olodumare. You're still talking about Vishnu. Just the complexities of their appearances is the concept. So I'm doing this in order to push back against the norms or institutional philosophy of religion in colleges and textbook industries, all these sorts of things, because ultimately, philosophy of religion as it stands right now is just serving Christian supremacist interests instead of actually doing philosophy of religion. Because when they say, does God exist? We all know they're talking about the Christian God and not some other God. So part of what I'm trying, that's part of the payoff here. Let's see. So what implications might this have? So for me, one of the implications, this is part of this book. I'm going to leave this here for you all. For me, it's interesting because what I want to talk about is the character development through narrative of these different God figures. So we could do a character development of Vishnu in the Bhagavad Gita. We could do the character development of Yahweh solely in Genesis, not Exodus, not other places, right? Just what do they look like right there? Or just the book of Job, right? What does that God look like? That one's weird, actually. If you read the first few sentences of Job, like it's just God, Yahweh is just hanging out. And then all of a sudden the adversary shows up and the God says to this guy, where did you just come from? It's like, can that God mean that question? And that's part of what I'm really interested in is why are there so many gods depicted in cultural literature where the gods are asking questions? Because the omni being, that being cannot ask a genuine question. All knowing, how could you ever ask a genuine question? But a being that has limitations like characters and stories, now they have room to ask questions. And my motive to be interested in that is political. Because somebody who has all the answers is not going to be a good listener. And if you're supposed to be Christ-like or God-like in these traditions, and they have all the answers, then we're going to get the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Right? The Christian supremacy leads to political ramifications. So anything we can do to try to fuck it up, right? Okay. So this is my attempt to try to stir the pot. Let's see. Two more things. So what I'm interested in doing next is getting into like a question of blasphemy and how people will say like, oh my God, during sex, to say that that is actually not a blasphemous use of the word God, but a blasphemous use of the word God is the textbook industry for philosophy of religion, where it's like, does God exist? God exists, right? That's actually a problematic use of the word God, whereas saying, oh, fuck, God, that's awesome, or that's divine. And this is what I was just working with my students. We're reading Feuerbach. And Feuerbach inspired Marx to do the critical analysis of capitalism. And Feuerbach has this really interesting way of flipping religion on its head. He calls it theological anthropology. And what he's doing is trying to say that religion says true things, but we need to interpret it humanistically to say we need to flip everything. And his method, even though Chomsky took it and used it in linguistics, he calls it transformational grammar, where you take a sentence from religion, like God is love, and what you do to bring it back to us instead of alien, this is where Marx gets alienation from. For Feuerbach, religion alienates us from our essence rather than facilitates our spiritual growth. Because when we say God is love, we've reified divinity into this thing, this entity over there, and then attributed love to that thing. But now, what about me and my love? And so he says, just take the sentence and flip it, say love is the subject of the sentence, and then we've got to revise how we say the word God. Love is divine. Our love is divine. And that's supposed to unlock our kind of deeper spiritual capacity. Instead of thinking that to be religious is to be over there like in heaven or in nirvana, as if it's separate from where we are right now. Look, I think I was thinking about this on my breath, and then I'm going to stop. Because I'm interested, like, what does that do for us? Because, you know, I was thinking about like watching a movie where you're getting jump scares and you physically respond to them. Or contexts where, like, have you ever heard of indica? I'm talking about weed, right? You know, like in the couch, right? Like it makes your body feel like it's gravitating downward, okay? So how can we get that kind of visceral experience of predicates to say something like, love is divine for you to go, yeah, now that's connected with me. There's another connection here to Boltman talking about the charismatic function function of religion where it's like, if you're at church and somebody says you're forgiven, it's like, the preacher says, by the power vested in me by this institution, I now pronounce you kaboom, forgiven. And you're like, fuck yes, because I was really worried about that. Right? And you have this visceral response to a new predication. For me, it was when I was in graduate school and I'm getting my doctorate, I'm at the graduation ceremony, and the president of the university says, by the power vested in me by the state of Iowa, I now pronounce you kaboom, a doctor. And I'm like, holy shit, I'm now a doctor. I wasn't a doctor, and now all of a sudden I'm ontologically a different being because of this new through language, the performance character. All right, I'm gonna quit here because I can keep talking. I feel like I've talked too long.
Questions, start a discussion. Before, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if I'm gonna ask this question, but we'll get there. So I, in like high school, I had to take a class on world religions, and like one of the things that I noticed, it's kind of terrible when you talk about world religions, is like the desire to graft onto religion, like other cultures' religious experiences. Like the word religion is so bound up in this like context of Christianity that it kind of it warps our understanding of like what we might call religious practices in
Other culture.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have some Japanese friends where I say like, oh, that's religious. And they're like, I'm not religious. And I'm like, you literally just worship the Buddha. And they're like, that's just culture.
Yeah. So to get my question, like, do you have any advice for that, or any and even to like draw this back to Wittgenstein and his idea of like family resemblance?
Yeah.
Do you think there's something there?
Yeah. So one book that I find very useful for this, they don't really reference Wittgenstein, but they're doing more like Nietzschean and Foucauldian genealogy. And they're tracing the history and the colonial function of world religious discourse. There wasn't such a thing as Buddhism until the 1800s. And there's only Buddhism because these European colonist scholars said, oh, we found these books in Nepal. This is true Buddhism. All of this stuff, like Zen, that's bastardization, right? And so the Europeans are the ones who determined, this is why Mohammedanism was the term, because Europeans named a religion instead of Muslims themselves, right? So there's this book titled The Invention of World Religions by Tomoko Masuzawa. And her argument is about kind of how does the industry of religious studies as a field maintain or challenge Eurocentric hegemony. And it seems that when we trace the history of world religious discourse, that its origins were in the maintaining of European hegemony. And that now, so her next question is, we're at a spot where we start to think about things like pluralism, religious pluralism, not in the philosophical sense, but in the social sense. Where it's like, you've probably heard people say things like, well, all religions say the same thing, ultimately. Love each other, blah, 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 right?
Yeah, coexist.
What's the difference between that and colorblind racism? Colorblind racism is like, I don't see color, right? And it's like, oh, wait, so you're just going to negate the oppressive conditions under which some people live versus other people. You're going to negate that by saying that race doesn't exist. And so it's the same thing with that she's trying to get at with this move towards pluralism in contemporary like attempts to say, let's do interfaith work, let's do religious studies, a comparative study of religions. They're all saying the same thing. Like, well, why can't we just recognize people are different and be okay with that instead of trying to reduce everybody to the same? I could keep going. I feel like I'm talking forever. Just can somebody else talk?
How about do ghosts exist?
Do ghosts exist?
That doesn't sound like a problematic question as in the way that you're
Because
talking
I
about.
don't think ghost is a title or a role that somebody has to fulfill.
I think you could also say.
How about like, do unicorns exist?
Right, that seems legit.
That's
Like
fine.
I never, so those shoes are very unicorn. Right, that, it doesn't make sense, but if I say those shoes are divine. Yeah, could we turn unicorn in? Right, this is what I was saying, like proper names can eventually become a predicate. When I say something like, oh, those
You say
shoes are
it.
so Eric.
Yeah.
It's the start of a proper name starting to become a
Well,
predicate.
we do say that people ghost us when they don't show up.
In a verb, right, ghosting is a verb there.
Yeah, I think you like, I mean, just go with that as an example. Do ghosts walk the walls, ghosts interact with stuff, do they have a physical presence or are they just material? So it's,
Do all those questions make sense?
It's however far down you wanna try to analyze it.
But the specificity allows us to, right, and so this is,
So the same thing applies in this case, right?
right,
that's
so,
how it
so
goes.
we can ask, like, does God exist? But the first response is, which God? Oh, Vishnu? Okay, let's talk about Vishnu or Brahma or whatever, right? Like, let's specify which God we're actually talking about instead of this vague thing that, like, people are actually projecting what they want into it instead of actually understanding what's going on. Because, right, like, think about a debate. Do y'all know, like, Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ken Ham is the guy that does, sorry to laugh, answers in Genesis. He's the one that commissioned the building of Noah's Ark in Kentucky. By the way, it flooded in the last year, and they're trying to sue the insurance or the contractors that built it to say you didn't build it. Anyway, that's a totally different. But they had a debate. They had a debate in 2014. It was like on, I don't know what channel. I watched it on YouTube. It's still on YouTube somewhere. It's really good. And they're talking past one another. They're right, like this is not a promotion of atheism. What I'm doing is not promoting atheism. It's not promoting theism either. It's basically saying atheists and theists haven't got their terms down well enough. And right now, they're not even playing language games. They're just throwing words around, hoping that something sticks. So it's not to say that no gods exist, right? It's just to say that when we are speaking at this level of abstraction that appears over and over in things like the logical problem of evil, for instance. This is a real problem that atheists and theists, philosophers try to engage in. And one of the claims is the omni being is, but they don't say omni. What they say is God is all good and all powerful. Yet egregious evils exist. Egregious evils seems incompatible with the God's power, and right. So everything I'm saying, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I'm saying, no, that actually doesn't make sense yet. Because which God is all powerful? There's only one use of a word that's even close to all powerful in the Christian Bible. And it's in the book of Revelations. And they call Jesus or God, and I forget, and honestly, I don't care, Almighty. Almighty. But what I want to know is the history of the word Almighty coextensive with the history of the word all powerful, or do they actually have separate cultural origins? In which case, it's harder to say, oh, see, that's proof all powerful is in the Bible. You see what I'm getting at? Like, I want them to be separate so that we can go, okay, we need to start over and reread this, right? Let's reread this in such a way that we're not continually bringing into it this presupposition that we had before we.
I guess one question I have is like, when atheists have conversations with theists, they sometimes will say, well, our position is just that you're only natural beings.
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And when they talk about it in positive terms, right, rather than negative terms, they're doing something different. And they think they're doing something different, right? Because they can also agree that this question is not meaningful
Yeah,
and have that be consistent with the
Yeah.
fact that they've said, the only thing that I'm committed to are natural.
yeah,
So
so
then does that for you bring up like the question, do supernatural beings exist? Or,
yeah, okay, so
you
there's
know what I'm
this,
saying?
yeah, so I'm really interested in the field religious studies as a field separate from philosophy. And I think of religious studies as intrinsically interdisciplinary. You've got historians of religion, you've got psychologists of religion, you've got sociology, you've got philosophers of religion, all of these people engage in this. And so one of the questions that comes up in like negotiating the field of religious studies is, can people who aren't religious teach about religion? Or another question is, can you be accurate about your religion if you are religious? Okay, and so then they're saying like, what's a term that we can use to try to capture like the heart of different religions? And they're struggling with like, can we use supernatural? Would that, right? And so right now the term that's being used most often is super empirical, because there's the concept of nature is itself politically loaded. And so we can't be naive about nature, right? Like we think about wilderness. Wilderness is actually our construct. So what we designate as wilderness, a wilderness preserve, that's us doing it. There is no wilderness, there's our wilderness. And so when we say something like, oh, it's only natural that boys will be boys, that's fucked up. Like, don't be complicit with toxic masculinity, because you're making it seem as if nature is making this happen. So for me, the issue is not so much like, can we ask the question, are there supernatural beings? To me, the person who is purporting to be a naturalist, like I want to know the political underpinnings of this position before we would get into religion.
Yeah, I think, sorry to interject, along those lines, I think part of the difference that I have in having discussions with people about religious things, my wife in particular,
Yeah.
let's say,
Ooh.
bad idea maybe, is the fact that this exact point that I think you're trying to make is that how do we don't agree. So how do we have a discussion that gets anywhere when I say, well, what do you mean by God? And they ask me if I believe in God. What would you mean by
Yeah, exactly. Belief
Yeah,
is
how do
another
you-
concept that's like,
like,
there's lots of language games that are like, some people will say, I firmly believe. And I'm like, what's the opposite of firmly believe? Like sloppily believing?
Yeah.
Like,
So how do you get anywhere in the discussion? Because what I find myself doing, not just with her, but with other people, is kind of, it's not necessarily, it somewhat feels like dodging the question, because I'm just like, well, what do you, first off,
but
what do
it's
you care?
dangerous. Are we in the Bible Belt? We're like on the edge of the Bible
So,
Belt, at least, right?
Yeah, I should
Right.
also say, just as a little bit of context to the question, former super LDS Mormon, now I would describe myself as being atheistic, so like there's. and my
Yeah,
life
and
is still
at
very
a certain
much-
point, I'm atheist relative to other people, right? Like
Right.
everybody's an atheist relative to somebody.
Right. So again, particularly the question, does God exist? Not a nonsensical question. I tend to agree, because it's how do you even lock down something as big of a concept as God? I think that's what you're driving at, kind of.
Well, except the way that you just said it makes it sound as if the word God, loosely speaking, has like some content.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm trying to say is the question is nonsensical. You're asking about a specific God,
Right.
and so then
Do
it's
I
like,
believe in your God?
exactly, and your God, right? So that's where it's like, okay, you say that you believe in this specific God, the God of the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
right? And then you point to a passage where that God does something crazy and you're like, you believe in that?
Right.
Like, that's what you subscribe to? And then they're gonna say, oh, no, like, some of it's wrong. And then it's like, oh, so you're just gonna pick and choose? Like,
Yeah. It's cherry
but I don't have an answer or solution to you to this, where
Well, yeah.
if you're in a intimate relationship with somebody who has a fundamentally different religious outlook than you,
I did it too.
it
so
is
it's my fault.
possible. I think it is possible for there to be like interreligious harmony.
We're making it work.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't want to get that impression,
Yeah,
but it's how do you, not just with her, but with anybody, you know, what's my reply to someone who says, does God exist? And I'm like, other than saying,
are you
Like, I'll just
interested
get- I'll
in the
just get-
conversation? I mean, you
I-
came to
I
this
am.
speech, but
yeah,
if somebody
I-
were to ask me that, I would just be like, you wanna just get a cheeseburger?
yeah,
Right, I would
because-
just change the
yeah.
topic, like, I'm just not interested in the question.
Yeah, what I've found it, again, is depends on what level of religiosity the interlocutor is, finds himself.
Yeah.
So, you know, I
Yeah,
would
what's
say,
the practical pay? So for me, the practical payoff of this sort of thing is less, how do you get rid of them asking you that question? And more, how do we both enjoy the question?
right,
And get to a spot where, look, like, I'm not trying to persuade you to be an atheist.
right,
You're not trying to persuade me to be to reconfirm my commitment to the LDS community, right? All we're doing is having an enjoyable conversation about something we've been taught that you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table.
right, right. So I enjoy it.
Right, and so if you can enjoy it, but if they don't enjoy it
Right.
because your soul is on the line,
Yeah,
right? I mean, how do you get them to be able to enjoy the conversation? And look, like, I haven't perfected it.
right. There is no answer to that. But I mean, just
This is my attempt at a
Sorry.
new way to get around.
I don't mean to switch the subject.
Do it.
What about somebody asking like, does the devil exist? It's the same thing for you.
Which version of what concept of the devil? Does a devil exist? Right? Like, does any devil exist?
What would you say?
I would say there is a figure in the narrative of Job that is called Ha-Satan. That's the Hebrew, which translates to the adversary. Inasmuch as that is a character in the narrative of Job, exists enough for me, right? Like, do fictional characters exist? Yeah. Do they exist in the same way that physical bodies exist? No. What? Yeah, they do.
No, I said, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like, and fictional beings have living, we all know that race is a social construct.
Yeah.
But if we were to say race is just a social construct, that would be negating people's lived experience of racial oppression. Racism is real. Races are not, right? That's literally what race is a social construct means. So race is a fiction that has impacted our lives, right? Some people to the point where they have physiological illnesses as a result of the stress of it, right?
Yeah.
So if that fiction can shape our lives, why can't the fiction of I pray facing Mecca shape my life, right? I'm talking about praying Salat in Islam. But we think like fiction means false, but fictions aren't false,
No.
right? But this is what I'm saying. It's really way more interesting to get into narratives. So which devil, what narrative, like does what is it, Lucifer, the TV show on Netflix? Have you seen this?
I haven't seen it. I've heard that.
It's cute, whatever. It's fine. I think it's part of isn't it part of the Marvel universe? Which is weird, but anyway, because God shows up, and apparently God's a character in the Marvel universe, which is really interesting, actually. But
That's awesome.
so is Lucifer real to the degree that that show has actually had impacts on people's lives? Yeah. Does the devil exist? Like, what for me, if somebody's asking me that question and I know where they're coming from, I might be suspicious of why they're asking me that. Right? You're asking me that in the context of a discussion about the grammar of religious discourse. But often when we are actually asked that question, they have an agenda, which is, I'm trying to save you from the devil, right, or something like this. And I'm like, I don't need saving. I've been saved by the blood of the Lamb. I'm good, or whatever. I mean, I'm not really saved, but I. What do you think? Is it all bullshit? No?
I'm just saying it is.
Okay.
Which aspect?
I don't know all of it, any of it. It's just interesting.
It's kind of like it's opening my mind to see that there's a discussion.
Yeah, like another thing, like in philosophy, in the 20th century, like in the 1950s, there was this thing called the linguistic turn, where everybody was like, let's all look at language a lot more closely because maybe the answers are there. How do we, right? All of our metaphysical problems, all of our epistemological problems are really issues of language. And now we're kind of to a point where people are like, nah, that's passe. What's really happening is neuroscience, physics. Like, you should really be doing philosophy of science if you're going to do serious philosophy. And I'm kind of going, that's great. Like, you guys can do that, but I don't understand why we have to have a politic of what's true philosophy. I'm still going to do philosophy of language stuff because I see benefits to it. Like, you know, you were just saying, like, yeah, if I become more self-conscious about the language, maybe that will help with certain things. But in other contexts, maybe I need to do more philosophy of physics or something like that.
Cool, we've run out of time. Thanks so
All right.
much, everybody, and let's thank Dr. Dickman for thanks everybody online.
And if you want to look a little more, it's chapter 4. There's a section in the book that's going to be here. Chapter 4 has a little section on that.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, we'll leave the book in the lobby if anybody wants to check it out. Thanks everybody for